Hello, Earth System Science students, and welcome to this video lecture for Chapter 13, Introduction to Landform Study, Part 3. This is the third of 5 videos on this topic. In this lecture video, we're going to discuss the concept of continental drift, or the movement of continents, plate tectonics, which is a modern version of continental drift, and then we will take a look at the 7 major tectonic plates. Continental drift is essentially the idea that continents and other landmasses have shifted over time. Now, what we're talking about here is geologic time, an amount of time massively exceeding human lifespans and most human conceptions of time. This aligns with the related idea that the current configuration of land masses and oceans on Earth's surface is not what it has always been, nor quite likely what it may always be. The idea of continental drift was introduced by the German scientist Alfred Wegener in 1915. Wegener was brilliant. He was the full package. He was a climatologist, a geologist, a meteorologist, a geophysicist. He did his thesis in astronomy, and he was a polar explorer. So while Wegener was conducting long-term climate research in Greenland, he began to notice during his work there and as he traveled to other locations, fossil evidence of similar plants, animals, and other organisms, rocks, and minerals in places where they did not seem to really belong. In addition, although he was not the first person to notice and comment on this, Wegener pointed out that the borders and the outlines of modern continents almost fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, kind of like you see here on this image. So to explain this and the fact that he saw all these similar things happening in places where they didn't seem to belong, Wegener hypothesized that there had at one time existed a supercontinent that he called Pangaea. Pangaea had a northern hemisphere version or component and a southern hemisphere version or component. The northern hemisphere component, as we would think of the northern hemisphere today at least, was called Laurasia. The southern hemisphere component was called Gondwana. Now, this was a very revolutionary idea at the time, that all of the continents were a single continent at one time, all joined together. It was not well received. But the reason that Wegener advanced this idea, that it was one of the only ways that he could think of to explain how you would have identical species of plants existing in places that were now separated by oceans, in places where the climates did not match the organisms that he was seeing in these places. Some of the supporting evidence that Wegener found for continental drift included evidence of glaciations. Once again, in places separated by oceans, but also in locations that we know today have only a tiny bit of snow and ice and no present-day glaciers. Evidence of glaciation was found in southern South America, southern Africa, southern India, and what is now the modern southern coast of Australia. So how would this be possible? Now, this glacial evidence was in the form of landforms and the modifications glaciers make to Earth's surface, which we unfortunately are not going to have time in this class to discuss glacial geomorphology, but it's a really interesting topic. But there was evidence of glaciation in all these areas, despite the fact that those places are not relatively cold today, and they are separated by oceans. Another form of evidence that Wegener found was ancient rocks on different continents, again in the modern sense of continents, separated by oceans. The most reasonable explanation for that possibility was that all of the rocks were from the same place originally and/or were created by the same processes. But something had to have changed in the system to separate them or push them apart. The third bit of supporting evidence for what we call continental drift was that Wegener found evidence in the fossil record of animals that lived on different continents with different climates. He found fossil evidence of animals in Africa and South America, again, currently separated by oceans, that were relatively small terrestrial organisms. These were organisms that did not swim, or at least certainly could not swim, large distances. Plants as well. Now, plants are more or less mobile, as they can expand their range through pollination, since their pollen can be transported by water or wind. But again, finding similar plants across an ocean was incredibly unusual. Now, the supporting evidence was important because it strongly suggested that the continents had, in fact, drifted and then changed position over time. Like I said, Wegener's ideas were not well accepted by his scientific colleagues. In fact, his entire proposal of continental drift almost ruined his scientific career because his colleagues thought he was totally nutso. And this is why. Despite the evidence that Wegener had of ancient rocks on different continents currently separated by oceans, of fossil records of similar plants and animals living in vastly different climates from what they're in now, and evidence of past glaciations in places like southern India that are currently tropical and incredibly warm, despite all of that, the one thing he could not explain was the mechanism of movement. So his colleagues, to placate him, offered alternative explanations, such as the continents not actually being closer together, but the animals swimming across the ocean. Yeah, well, maybe. But the types of organisms he was finding were very small and not well adapted to swimming. So that probably didn't happen. For plants and rocks, his colleagues suggested that they might have floated across the ocean. Again, possible, but highly unlikely, due to the vast distance between continents separated by water. And remember, these are oceans we're talking about, so this is not a calm lake somewhere that you can swim across. Ocean has all kinds of turbulence going on, with waves and storms and all kinds of things that want to come up and eat you. The chances of any of those organisms or rocks surviving a trip across the ocean is extremely, astronomically unlikely. It was not until the 1960s, a long time afterward, that Wegener's ideas began to gain more support. So essentially, this idea of continental drift that Wegener presented in 1915 just kind of lay dormant for quite a long time, again because despite its evidence, he couldn't explain how it happened. He couldn't explain why these different bits of evidence were in different places or how that might have occurred. Now, there were great advances in technology after the Second World War. And starting around the 1960s, computers started to become more powerful. Granted, they were extremely large, taking up entire rooms, and did not have a lot of power. They would often take up that entire room, probably have less computing capacity than a standard standalone calculator today. They certainly didn't have the computational power that we carry around with us with our cell phones in our pockets every day. But what really tipped the scale and helped Wegener's idea gain some strength was that marine geology, or an interest in the rocks in the ocean floor, and undersea mapping was being explored during the 1960s. So these explorations were possible due to more powerful computers, first off, and the development of sonar and radar technologies, which were wartime technologies developed during the Second World War. As these marine rocks were found and the ocean floors were mapped using these technologies, what people started to find was that there were similarities in the rocks in places that you would not expect to find similarities between rocks. Not only were the rocks chemically similar and sometimes found in alternating bands of different rocks, but they also had different magnetic signatures, suggesting that the polarity or magnetism of the Earth's poles had changed over time. Scientists use that information to suggest that perhaps the continents did actually move, because the signatures found on one side of the Atlantic Ocean basin were similar to signatures found on the other side of the basin. One of the only ways that could possibly happen was if the land masses or the plates on Earth's surface were actually capable of moving. Which brings us to plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is the modern day version of continental drift. It's essentially the modern theory to explain how and why the continents move. It's that missing puzzle piece that Wegener just couldn't come up with, that mechanism for movement. The entire concept of plate tectonics is based on the idea that the lithosphere, that upper portion of the mantle and parts of the Earth's crust, is fragmented. It is broken into multiple pieces, or what we call plates. Each of these plates or fragments moves in a distinct way and as a discrete unit. As the plates move, they interact with each other differently, depending on that direction of movement. Now we're going to discuss these plate boundaries and how the different chunks of Earth's crust interact with each other in a different video, but generally speaking, plates can either diverge, which is to pull apart, or converge, which means they come together and collide with each other. Or they can move laterally, meaning that they will slide past each other. Scientists have now identified lots of different tectonic plates, some large and some small. All are important to some degree, but we're going to take a quick look at the 7 major plates of Earth's surface. The 7 major tectonic plates that we're going to take a look at are the Eurasian plate, the African plate, the Antarctic plate, the Australian plate, the Pacific plate, the North American plate, and the South American plate. And because of the material we need to cover in this chapter, we are not going to focus on the individual characteristics of any of these major plates. However, I would strongly recommend that you know that these are the 7 major plates: the Eurasian plate, the African plate, the Australian plate, the Pacific plate, the North American plate, and the South American plate. These plates are the most important, partly because of their size and partly because they are the most active and interact with other plates most often. And that brings us to the end of this lecture for Chapter 13. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.